Thanks for coming. My name is Trent Griffith, and my wonderful wife Andrea is up here on the front row. And we're doing a workshop together this afternoon. So I don't know what y'all signed up for this afternoon, but Andrea and I are going to be talking about parenting adult children in our workshop. So how many of you have adult children? All right. We'll see you at our workshop this afternoon. All right. Doing a little recruiting for that. Let me find out who's in the room. How many of you are lead pastors of a church? Raise your hand. They're all in Crawford session right now. I told Crawford this morning, I realized we're competing. It's like I'm not expecting anybody in my session. Matter of fact, I'm thinking about finishing early and moving over to his in just a minute. I was expecting to see more women in my session, which I'm excited about as well. So I'll be upfront and honest with you a little bit. The title of the session is a little misleading, okay? So am I a disciple maker? The key word that you're going to hear about 1,000 times in this session is actually in the second line, intentionality. Because disciple making requires intentionality. Let me give you the big idea of the session. By the way, everybody pick up a fill in the blank sheet. If you're paying attention, you realize there's way too much content in here to cover in an hour. I'm going to be editing on the fly. Okay? There's 5 big main points to the message. I'm going to give you all of those, and then if I skip a blank, don't freak out. If you're an engineer or an accountant or an elder chairman, you're going to have problems because I'm going to skip a blank or two. We can fill those in later. Here's the big idea of the message, and you'll probably need to write this down. Intentionality is about intentionally encouraging followers of Jesus to intentionally take their next step. Disciple making is about intentionally encouraging followers of Jesus to intentionally take their next step. How many of you, like me, have somewhere strapped on your body right now a step counter? Okay. How many of you actually track your steps? How many of you would know how to look at your steps right now and find out? Everybody look at your steps right now. How many steps have you taken today? Somebody yell out a number. How many? 1,065. Can anybody beat 1,065 this morning? 2,200. Can I have anybody that beat 2,200? All right. Somebody has gone on a walk already this morning. All right. So here's the deal. What if we could strap on every disciple in our church some step counter that recorded how many steps they took intentionally following Jesus? Several years ago, I was out of shape and I wanted to get back in shape, and so I strapped one of these things to my wrist, and I realized there's all kinds of different apps on the App Store to encourage you to take more steps. There's actually these virtual coaches and AI that will actually encourage you throughout the day to take more steps. And I found one on the App Store. It was called Zombie Run. Here's the way it works. You strap it on. It talks to you while you're actually on a walk or a run. And while you're walking or running, it will scare you into taking more steps. It will kind of create this virtual zombie that is somewhere behind you, and it's coming after you, and it's approaching, and it's getting closer. And the idea is you need to run a little faster. You need to go a little farther than you think you can go, lest you be eaten by the walking dead, okay? Now, that is not the way we want to encourage disciples to take steps. We're not here to scare anyone or to shame anyone for how slowly they're moving, but there is something about intentionally encouraging someone to, word for the morning, be a little more ambitious about following Jesus. And so hopefully you're in some type of a disciple-making relationship. Everybody needs to be a disciple of someone else, and everybody needs to be a disciple maker of someone else. So here's the first big point today is this. Intentional disciple making is the culture of a church immersed in the gospel. Intentional disciple making is the culture of a church immersed in the gospel. And so we are the Great Commission Collective, and so we are all about the Great Commission. The Great Commission is not a Bible phrase. We've kind of labeled that over Matthew 28, which says here, "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am always with you." I'm always with you to the end of the earth. So the first step someone takes as a disciple is what? In following Jesus, it is to be baptized. If we are disciple makers, we're on a mission to share the gospel with people in hopes that they would repent and believe the gospel message, and they would take the next step in identifying themselves as a follower of Jesus through the biblical public profession of faith, which is what? Baptism. I thought the public profession of faith was raising a hand, signing a card, walking down the aisle, because I grew up Baptist. And then I realized, oh, Jesus actually has this thing called baptism. And so baptism is this public act. So the first step a disciple makes is the public identification with Christ through baptism. And the second step, or the next step that we're to engage disciples in, is to teach these growing disciples. So first step, baptize new disciples, and then teach growing disciples. Philippians 1:27, "Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or in my absence, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel." Do you see all the intentionality in that verse? There's a manner of life. There's the way you walk through life. And there's a standing. That means I'm not backing up, but not just standing. I'm moving forward, taking a next step, striving side by side. What is that? That's an intentional disciple-making relationship with another person. So here's a question. What are we making? When Jesus said, "Go and make disciples," exactly what is that? What is a disciple? What's the definition? What did Jesus mean by that? The actual word disciple literally means learner. A disciple is a learner. He's a lifelong learner. By the way, there are not two categories of Christians: believers and disciples. I was in a meeting last week with a high-level president of a large Christian organization, and he, in my opinion, made the mistake of creating these two categories by saying, we have all these believers out there. We have all these believers filling our churches and all these people identifying with Christ. We need to make these believers into disciples. Like, time out. That is not the way Jesus talked about disciples. Matter of fact, he talked about disciples who weren't believers, and they eventually fell away, the crowds that we just heard about in the last session, right? But if you are a believer in Jesus, then you are a disciple. And if you are not a disciple, you don't need to become a disciple. Well, you do need to become a disciple. You need to become a Christian, which Jesus calls a disciple. You don't have these remedial Christians, and then you have like these superpower Christians that are disciples, right? If you're a follower of Jesus, you're a disciple. And that means you're a lifelong learner. So a disciple is committed to learning and following the ways and practices of his teacher. A disciple maker is committed to modeling and teaching disciples. Do you know what a model is? A model is something that is someone who wears something and makes it look so good, you want to wear it too. I am modeling this shirt for you. Some of you have already been distracted from the content of the message because I'm making this shirt look so good. It's like, I got to get one of those. because I want to look that good when I'm standing. Like I'm not making this shirt look any better than it actually could be. Some of you could make this shirt look a lot better. But we're supposed to wear Christ in such a way that's like, you look so good wearing Christ. I want to know how I can get one of those. That's a model. And so that's what a disciple maker does. Now, disciples are lifelong learners. And by the way, did I fill in the blank? Disciples are not remedial Christians. Disciples are lifelong learners. Disciples take intentional steps toward and with Jesus as they are taught by intentional disciple makers. And so all disciples are at all kinds of various stages in their life, and we just want to help them take their next step. So what are some intentional steps we're trying to get them to take? Disciple making begins by intentionally moving toward lost people, inviting them to intentionally follow Jesus. So if you're a disciple maker, that doesn't mean you just work with people who are already disciples. We go to pre-believers. I don't like to use the word unbeliever. I'm more optimistic than that. Like, if I meet somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus, I'm going to call you a pre-believer because we just haven't hung out enough. You just haven't, you don't quite understand how glorious Jesus is yet, right? So in that process, we want to engage pre-believers. Andrew and I, I was out of shape, and we have by the way, I planted and pastored Gospel City Church in Granger, Indiana. We planted it in 2009. We were there for 13 years. We recently moved out of that role into another role that moved us down to Orlando, Florida. We live in Orlando, Florida right now, and we're really missing the whole context of lead pastor, pastor's wife, and we're praying about what God would have us to do about all that. Anyway, while we were in Granger, there was a lady in our church who was a personal trainer. And I had back issues, and I was out of shape. And I went to her and was like, hey, can you help me get my back into shape? So she just said, yeah, come on. I'm going to plug you in to another training session I have with another dude. Now, the other dude, his name was Richard. He was 70 years old. And so I thought, thank you for giving me the easy class. The dude's running circles around me in the gym. The dude's lifting more weight. He's jumping higher. And I'm like trying to keep up with 70-year-old Richard. This began a 5-year relationship with Richard. The only time I ever saw him was in the gym. I rarely got to talk to him because I can not talk when I'm in the gym because I can't breathe. And yet he's running around. And Andrea kind of joined this group. Our children's ministry director joined the group. Like 3 other ladies joined the group, all from our church. So pretty soon we're all talking about church together. And Richard's just kind of eavesdropping. He's like, how did I get with these crazy church people, right? And Richard had kind of a nominal Catholic background. Pretty soon, one day, he shows up at my church. And he's sitting on the back row. He's really inconspicuous. And he's like, he finds out that like Trent actually has a lot to say when he can actually breathe. And so he hears the gospel, and he starts coming, and he starts talking about his nominal Catholic background, which emphasized all these rules and regulations. He's so confused, and like 5 years into this process, during a break in the gym, he just looked at me. He's like, "I think I'm ready to be baptized." He's like, "I got baptized by the Father Ted, who was the president of Notre Dame." I got, anyway, this is in South Bend, Indiana, and so he's got this deep Catholic background and everything. And so everybody at our church that gets baptized, they're required to share their story, and you got like 3 minutes. Richard took 18 minutes in the baptistry to share his story about how he's like it's a whole new world. By that time, he's 75. And so anyway, and now he's making disciples. He's leading small groups. He's sharing with everybody that that's the way it's supposed to happen. But there's some intentionality around moving toward pre-believers. Disciple making continues by intentionally moving toward disciples at all stages of maturity. Disciple makers take intentional steps with Jesus toward disciples to encourage disciples to intentionally step toward and with Jesus. You get it? So Jesus is already doing this. We're just joining him in the process. So here's why this is so critical. If there's no intentionality, there's no going. What's the Great Commission? Go. That's the only action word is go. Go, no intentionality, no going. No going, no movement. No movement, no baptizing. No baptizing, no teaching. No teaching, no disciple making. No disciple making, no multiplication. No multiplication, no church planting. No church planting, no church. No church, no evangelism. No evangelism, no disciples. That's why the end game of all of this is multiplication. There's a phrase that's probably one of the most often repeated phrases in my relationship with Andrea. I hear this phrase from Andrea multiple times a week. Here's the phrase. Are you going to go? Now, the context for that phrase is this. I'm usually driving when we're in the car together. She likes me to drive. I like to drive. So I drive, and inevitably we come to a red light. We come to the red light. I see this as an opportunity not to waste time. So I typically pull out my cell phone. Did I get any texts? Is there any going on here? And eventually the light turns green. Now, there's a rule in Andrea's head. If he does not make this car go in 1.3 seconds, he's going to need some encouragement and motivation. And so quite often I will hear this phrase, are you going to go? And the implication is, it is a sin to sit here when all indications are it is safe to move forward and stop holding up traffic behind you. Now, as annoying as that is, and as much as we still are working that out in our own marriage, that isn't a very appropriate question that the Holy Spirit, I believe, is asking of all disciple makers. Are you going to go? The light is green. I've promised to be with you. It's safe. Are you going to go? In other words, how much intentionality are we exercising? What are we waiting for? He's already told us the light is green. Go, make disciples of all nations. Here's point number 2. Intentional disciple makers never stop helping disciples take self-denying, cross-carrying steps toward and with Jesus. Where do we get all this self-denying, cross-carrying stuff? It comes from Jesus' definition of what a disciple really is. Luke 9:23. If anyone would come after me, if anyone would be my disciple, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Finally then, brothers, we ask you and urge you in the Lord Jesus that as you receive from us and how you ought to walk and to please God just as you are doing, that you do so more and more. So no matter how far you've come, there's more steps to take in that. So the physical growth of a church must never exceed the spiritual growth of the disciples at that church. We were blessed, and by the way, let me just say this up front. Any story I might tell about anything that happened that had anything to do with any connection I might have possibly had, all glory to Jesus, okay? So if I tell a story about something, our church experienced some pretty amazing growth. Started with 13 people in 2009. When we were finished in 2021, there was about 2,013 people, and we'd planted 8 other churches, okay? So we saw some amazing growth. But here, from a distance, if you saw the social media post, that's an amazing church. Here's the reality. Our physical growth outpaced our spiritual growth. And we were always trying to catch up to the spiritual growth to make it look like we were anything close to the maturity that had appeared on the outside from the physical growth. And so it can give you the illusion that you are spiritually stronger than you are when you have numbers and you have, butts in seats and, you have a production team and people are coming. And so that's why we always were intentional about discipleship, not attendance, not buildings and budgets. I mentioned earlier that the first point is disciple making is the culture of a church that's immersed in the gospel. I know nothing about strategy. I've never read a book on strategy. In those 13 years of pastoring our church, we never had a meeting about strategy. We never talked about strategy. But there was, in every meeting, intentionality around culture, around how do we behave and what's our values. And then we trusted the Lord to give the growth in all of that. So the intentionality of teaching what it means to be a disciple is that you deny yourself and you carry a cross. That's what it means to be a disciple. Because, does everybody understand growth and swelling looks the same? Okay? But growth is the result of health, and swelling is the result of infection and disease. So, again, from the outside, it's like, you're getting bigger. Yeah. Are you swollen? Or are you growing? And if you're not emphasizing carrying a cross, denying yourself, you may be swelling rather than growing. Disciple making requires intentionality. Disciples, did you know this? Disciples have a sinful tendency to get stuck in complacency. I do. And if I do not pay some attention to it, then I can think I'm doing okay. Charles Bridges, in his commentary on Proverbs 3, said this: "Do not despise the day of small things, but do not be satisfied with it either. Aim high, and you will come closer to reaching the mark. Religion must be a shining and progressive light. We must not make the mistake. We must not mistake the beginning for the end of the course. We must not sit down at the entrance and say to our soul, 'Take it easy now.' There is no point where we may rest in complacency as if there were no loftier heights. That is our duty and duty to climb." So again, he's talking about intentionality. Disciples can wrongly make humility and contentment the enemy of ambition. Guess where I got that point? From hanging out with Dave. All that stuff he shared about ambition is like my favorite book that Dave's ever written was his first book that is now out of print. I think he's getting ready to re-release it. It's called Rescuing Ambition. And I think he's putting all that content back out there because nobody ever read the first book he ever wrote. So I think it's going to come back out. But don't make humility and contentment the enemy of ambition. We've got to go after disciples. Disciples will listen to the most intentional voices in their ears. That means if you're a disciple maker, you've got competition. Every account they follow, sounds like disciple language, doesn't it? Every account they follow on social media is competing with what we want, the voice that we want to be in their ear. Disciples are made in the routine of mundane intentionality. So a conference like this is like a hyperdose of ambition and content and worship, and it's like, man, if we could just get all the people that we have influence, if we just get them in this room. Most of them don't have passports, and it's hard to get them here, and there's an expense. Don't overlook just the simple phone call, the text, "I'm praying for you. Here, I read this verse. I'll see you at church on Sunday. I want to sit next to you." And don't discount the small things that you do to get people to take a step. Number 3. Disciple-making churches create discipleship pathways that encourage disciples to take a step. Disciple-making churches create discipleship pathways that encourage disciples to take a step. How many of you could identify the discipleship pathway in your church? You could tell me what it is right now if I ask you to stand and tell me what. Can you do it? You're nodding your head. Can you do it on the back row? Stand up. What is the discipleship pathway at your church? What's the name of the church?
Hope Bible Church Niagara.
All right. What's the discipleship pathway?
Step one, which is discover hope. So it's like meeting the staff, meeting the elders, seeing the church vision, and then step two after that is hope essentials. That's like finding out the doctrine of the church and finding out like how we're disciples of Jesus Christ. And then after that, it is joining a small group and then serving and then becoming a member.
Nice. All right. So what they've done, did you notice there's some intentionality around it? Somebody sat down and is like, if somebody shows up at our church for the very first time, do they know where to take their next step in this church? And if you, without that, you just show up, it's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. Just, can you come back next week? Like, okay. You just come back again the other week. Look, okay, well, how do I, is there movement? Probably the most influential book upon our church in the early days, and even to this day, was a book called Simple Church by Tom Rainer. And it's a simple book about how to create a simple church. Simple doesn't mean easy. Matter of fact, simple is very hard. Because simple means four things. If I can remember them, it means that you clarify what you're doing. We are a church. Let me define church for you, okay? Let me define disciple for you. I'm going to clarify what a disciple is, what a disciple isn't. I'm going to clarify what a worship service is. We're going to clarify what a worship song actually is versus a performance song, a vertical song, all that. We're going to define what a sermon is. We're going to, all of that. So clarity, and then movement. Now, clarity, alignment, which means everything in the church, everything a church does is going to be connected to what we clarified the church is supposed to be. So the small groups are going to be aligned with what's going on in the worship ministry, which is aligned to what's going on in the sermon, which is aligned with what's going on in small groups and children's ministry and women's ministry and men's ministry and like, what about the food pantry? Well, do we have a food pantry? Does it align with everything else we're doing? So you simplify. What you say is, we're not going to do everything, because if we try to do everything, we'll actually do everything really badly. So we're going to align a few things we're going to choose to do, and we're going to do those really good. We're going to simplify, we're going to clarify, we're going to simplify. So clarity, alignment, movement is the third step. Movement means taking a step. Everything's about following, so there's movement. It means that when a person shows up at the church, by the way, do you understand, before they ever show up at the church, they've checked out your website and your social media page. So there's got to be some clarity in what we're doing with all of those things. So if they survive looking at your website, okay, and they're going to, what the first thing they're going to click is like, how does this guy communicate? They're going to click on that sermon. And so if they gulp real hard and show up at your church, when they get there, now do I come to the membership class? Do I get in a small group? Is there a clear gospel presentation where we kind of clarify where you're at in your walk with the Lord? And then how do I embrace membership? And then how do I serve? How do I lead? And once you get into the leadership track, like, how do I become an elder? And then how does the elder become a church planter? Do you see all the movement in that? Okay. Your next church planter may be in middle school right now. But is there a pathway for him to like get into like the next level of his maturity in the Lord? So anyway, that's what we talk about when we talk about these discipleship pathways. A church can't make someone take a step, can't force somebody to do that. You don't want to be the zombie church, scare you to take a next step. intentionally expose, a church can intentionally expose stalled movement. It can intentionally teach disciples how to move toward and with Jesus. It can intentionally point people to Jesus as irresistibly desirable to follow. That's the goal, is to glorify Jesus, point people to Jesus, exalt Jesus, so that Jesus is so irresistibly desirable, they move toward him rather than run from him. And then they intentionally create pathways for disciples at all stages to take their next step. So I kind of talked about the discipleship pathway. There's a book, there's two books that kind of go together. It's called the Trellis and the Vine, and then there's a follow-up book called The Vine Project. And it really is a project to help the leaders of your church kind of define how do we encourage people to take their next step, so that if they're at this stage, they know what the next thing is they need to do. And then that can be in all kinds of different areas of our discipleship. So a lot of people need to learn how to follow Jesus in their finances, because they're living paycheck to paycheck. They don't know how to save anything. They can't give anything, because at least they think they can't give anything because they spent what they should have given on something else. That's a discipleship issue. Giving is a discipleship issue, right? So you can have a pastor or an elder stand up and teach a 6-week course, and you can send people through, you can guilt people into not giving, or you can teach them how Jesus is the provider and he gives us some of what belongs to him, and then we manage that in a way that is going to have eternal impact. Those are discipleship issues. Parenting is a discipleship issue. Evangelism is a discipleship issue. Do people know how to share the gospel? Have they learned how to have a gospel conversation with somebody? So all of these are discipleship issues, and all of them come from a clear discipleship pathway. Let me talk about this. There's 5 lanes of intentionality in a discipleship pathway. The first is intentional evangelism. And we mentioned moving toward pre-believers with the hopes that the pre-believer would move from unbelief to belief. So last month, I had one of the greatest weeks of my life. I was invited to come back to Lawton, Oklahoma, which was my hometown, to the church where I met the Lord. So I didn't grow up in a Christian family. When I was 7 years old, my family moved from Muskogee, Oklahoma. I am an Okie from Muskogee. Literally. I was born in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And our family moved to Lawton, Oklahoma when I was 7 years old. Of all of the places my family could have moved, of all of the neighborhoods my family could have moved into, in all of the houses that my family could have moved into in that neighborhood, we moved into 6910 Eisenhower Drive. 6912 Eisenhower Drive was occupied by a family, the Hessels, who had a teenage daughter. I was 7, so I didn't notice. She was dating a guy that would come by the house and see her. Lori eventually married Mike. Mike became the youth pastor at Cameron Baptist Church. When Mike would come and see Lori, he would see me outside shooting baskets in the driveway, and he would invite me to church. And he convinced me to come to church because he said there will be 3 things there: donuts, lock-ins, and girls. I'm interested in going to church for the first time in my life. So I go, I hear the gospel, I meet Jesus, I repent of sin, follow him with all of my heart. I told him I'd go anywhere and do anything. That's why I'm in Canada today. And Mike began to disciple me and teach me how to open the Bible and understand what it meant and apply it to my life. And then I met the Lord as a 15-year-old. As a 17-year-old, senior in high school, my church offered an evangelism training class called Evangelism Explosion. I took that class as a senior in high school, 17 weeks of learning 5 points about God's grace, God, man, Christ, faith. God, did I leave out sin? God, man, and wait, anyway, I know how to share the gospel now somehow. Anyway, um, anyway, it's grace, God, man, Christ, faith. That's the outline. Anyway, you use scriptures with it anyway, and we started going out and sharing the gospel, and lo and behold, people started responding, repenting, believing as we shared the gospel. Like I got addicted to this. And so I had football players on my team that met the Lord and friends at school. I was like, I think I want to do this the rest of my life. And so that was back in the 80s. So I went back there last month. Church was celebrating its 75th anniversary. And the way they celebrated was with a 4-day revival meeting. So Wednesday through Thursday. They invited me back to preach on Thursday night. Guess who was preaching on Wednesday night? 65-year-old Mike. Okay, and I was the young one. I was 56 on Thursday night. My best friend Ray, who was a missionary in China who came out of that church, he preached on Friday night. The pastor emeritus preached on Sunday. He's 82. He was the pastor that was there. The current pastor, another Mike, has been there for 45 years. Was the youth pastor, became the associate pastor. Now he's a lead pastor. He's 68. He's been there for 45 of the 75 years. And there were some and we all kind of descended. We'd scattered everywhere. We came back. My 7th grade Sunday school teacher, still there teaching 7th grade Sunday school. 8th grade Sunday school teacher, 9th grade Sunday school, 10th grade Sunday school teacher. My youth pastor was there. My minister of music came back. Anyway, it was a glorious time. The reason I share all that is to say this. There were some numbers shared during that time. There was a 5-year period in the 80s. I met the Lord in 1982, and really from about 1982 to 1987, the church grew from about 500 to 1,000, and there was someone baptized in every service for 5 straight years. Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. 2,094 people. And all of that was the result of somebody learning to share the gospel and then actually not just keeping it here, but bringing it here and then moving your feet toward the pre-believers so that they take a step to become a believer. And as a result of that thing, that marked me forever in understanding that discipleship begins by moving toward a pre-believer. So intentional evangelism needs to be something that our churches, like, does your church have an evangelism training program? Does it? Ish? To be honest with you, mine didn't. We were so busy just trying to hold the thing together. Like, we actually did kind of have a crash course on evangelism. We announced it. Like 268 people showed up on a Sunday night to learn how to share the gospel. They went out and shared the gospel, came back and reported. Anyway, we need to pay attention to that. Churches that emphasize expositional preaching and discipleship, sometimes we lose the first step of knowing how to engage people in the gospel. Number 2, an intentional church membership. I love that our brother back there kind of targeted that as part of the discipleship. It's moving a new disciple from friendship to family. It's moving them from the front porch into the living room. And once they're in the living room and they feel like family, we show them there's a kitchen where you get fed, but there's also a garage where there's work that gets done. Okay? So we're inviting you to take intentional steps more to feel like family. Are you just going to be a guest who consumes our food? You're going to get in the kitchen and you're actually going to fix the meal. Right? So the discipleship pathway at our church, we had 4 G's. So an intentional, we would say this, an intentional discipleship takes step in glorifying, gathering, growing, and going. Glorify, gather, grow, go. So glorifying was all about abiding in Jesus. It was just this corporate and individual worship with Jesus. And then gathering in groups. We help people understand, what's happening. Our church has a required membership meeting every Sunday. We expect you to be here. If you're not here, we're wondering, are you really family? This is a required meeting. It's not like we're going to like kick you out if you don't come, but like that's the expectation. It's like you've said to us you want to be intentional in your discipleship. Well, we come together to worship Christ corporately once a week. And so we gather, not just in large groups, we gather in small groups. So you have 3 different tiers. You have one to many, you have one to few, and you have one to one in your discipleship. So that's part of the pathway. And then growing, all kinds of different pathways. If you grow in your marriage, here's some intentionality about that. Parenting, discipleship, evangelism, all those different things. Number 3 is intentional maturity. It's moving a growing disciple from crawling to walking. Number 4, intentional leadership development. It's moving a mature disciple from following to leading. Maybe that's small group training. Maybe that's elder training. And then number 5 is intentional mobilization. And it's moving a called disciple from leading to multiplying. And I'm hoping that over the past 2 days, you've picked up the urgency around multiplication. As we've talked with the GCC staff, we've recognized it's like there's all this passion up here at the top of GCC. There's no shortage of vision from Dave. Did you pick that up? Like it's all real clear in his mind. But then as we how do we get this out of Dave's heart and mind onto an agenda item on the elder meeting, right? In these local churches, we can't force that. But the idea is if you don't grab this vision, then like he said this morning, we can become so internally focused that we lose the opportunity. That's why the residency kit's been produced. That's why you ought to be thinking about local and even global missions, the vision trips that GCC says, hey, just jump on a trip with us and go to Scotland or go to Africa or go to India or go to Nepal with us and see what's happening out there. It gets our eyes out outside of our church. One of the best things our church did, and I had nothing to do with it, there was a dear couple in our church, older couple, and they had a heart for people who were in retirement homes or nursing homes. They'd lost the ability to kind of mobilize themselves, and they weren't just going to jump in the car and go shopping, or they couldn't even jump in the car and go to church. And so there was a couple in our church that just began to engage these retirement homes and said, could we come in once a week and lead a Bible study? Could we sing some hymns? And then some men in our church who were aspiring church planters said, I need a place to preach. Trent's not going to give me the pulpit on Sunday morning. So where can I preach? Guess where they preached? In the retirement homes. They were blessed, and we graded their sermon just like as if they were preaching on a Sunday, and encouraged them and gave them feedback. And those people were just, they were loved and blessed, and these guys got a heart. A lot of them had a heart for preaching, but they didn't know how to have a heart for actual people. You want to get a heart for actual people? Get around people that actually have some real physical limitations. And so that encouraged them as well. I wrote this down. Disciples become disciple makers as disciple makers intentionally share their leadership. And that means that whatever resources that we have to entrust it to people. And so when I'm talking to pastors and planters that have some resources, we're talking about sharing resources. A residency, when you bring somebody in for a residency, what you mean is you're going to share your life with somebody. We sent out 3 guys to plant 3 churches kind of in concentric circles around us. One went north, one went east, and one went 5 miles south. And all those guys are here this week. And each one of them, what we did, we just carved out a spot for them on our staff and just said, this guy's going to be our church planter in residence. And that means we got to carve out a spot in the budget. But this is a temporary spot to shoot you out of the funnel to get you there. So, and really the job description for all those guys was just We just want you to come to staff meeting. We want you to come to elder meeting. We want you to go to youth group. We want you to go to the small group, to small groups and learn how to lead one of those guys. And we were sharing what we knew as much as we knew it, and then they can go incorporate and contextualize it in other places. On the sheet, did I print feed fat people? Did I say that? Is that on your sheet? Okay, I don't mean that to be offensive. That's an acronym. Do you know what a fat person is? Faithful, available, and teachable. Okay? All right? Faithful, and you got to feed those people. All right? If they're faithful, available, and teachable, you got to resource them. And then you have to maul people. Did I put that on the sheet? I'm realizing there's a reason I didn't put these on the sheets, right? Yeah. So maul people means you model, and then you assist, and then you watch, and then you launch them. So here's a guy, he doesn't know how to be a disciple maker. Well, just come and live in my shadow a little bit, and I'll do what I have learned how to do, and I'm going to model this for you. And he's like, man, you make that look so good. Can I wear one of those? Yeah. I'm going to now let you do it, and I'm going to come alongside you and assist. Maybe you do half, I'll do half. Maybe we'll kind of pass the baton back and forth. And then you mature a little bit, and then now you're going to do the whole thing. I'm going to be in the room, and I'm going to watch. I'm going to give you feedback how you do it. And then guess what? Kick you out of here. Go. Sink or swim. All right? So you got to maul people. Number 4, intentional disciple making is a prerequisite for intentional church planting. And this is where I said the title of this session is a little misleading, because here's the deal. We're trying to fulfill the Great Commission. We believe the best way to do that is by planting churches. In order to plant churches, we need church planters. Here's a misconception when we think about church planters. Everybody asks the questions. Jerry even said it this morning. Where do you find church planters? I mean, I've been in elder meetings. We're sitting around like, where are we going to find guys to plant churches? Here's the deal. You don't find church planters any more than you find disciples. The Great Commission is not go and find disciples. What is the Great Commission? Go and what? Make disciples. If you want a church planter, you have to make one. So where do you make a disciple? Where do you make a church planter from? Church planters are made from church leaders. Church leaders are made from disciples. Disciples are made from pre-believers. If you're going to ever have a church planter, you better go talk to some pre-believers, because every church planter at one time was a pre-believer. Was the snotty-nosed 7-year-old in his driveway shooting basketballs. And when Mike was driving by, he probably wasn't thinking, I'm going to make a church planter today. I'm going to go engage him. He was like, no, he just probably needs to come to church. And once he gets to church, hey, have you heard the gospel? Hey, do you know how to share the gospel? Hey, do you know how to study your Bible? Hey, I've got a 7th grade boys Sunday school class that I want you to lead and to teach. Hey, have you thought about going to seminary? Hey, we've got a youth pastor position for you. Hey, we'd like you to travel on this traveling itinerant revival team, which we did for a while. Hey, there's 13 people in Granger, Indiana that have been praying for a year and a half for a pastor. That was my discipleship pathway. So if you're going to plant a church, the pathway has to be there all along the way. Because you get this idea is like, yeah, we're going to go to a seminary and find a planter. Well, where'd the people at seminary show up from? A disciple-making church. So here's the deal. Become a disciple-making church. And by the way, if you're ever in a group of elders and they start asking, where are we going to find a planter? Like, don't look outside the room. Like, which one of you is going to be the next church planter? It's like, yeah, but I've got this business. Great training ground to plant a church, right? Hey, yeah. Someone shared with me one time, this is free, this is not even notes, but I had great elders. They were my best friends. We had great unity. They're still my best friends. And somebody shared with me one time, some elders, when they step into the elder meeting, they ascend the ladder of complexity, which means what's going to happen in the elder meeting is more complex than what they do all week. But the best elders are the ones, when they step into the elder meeting, they're descending the ladder of complexity. Like, their world is so complex at their business, they're so grateful to come to an elder meeting because it seems so simple, right? What's happening in their marketplace business is great training ground for leadership in a church. And so it could be, the elder meeting was very complex for me. I was ascending the ladder of complexity. But I was grateful, especially when it came to, like, administrative things, that some of these guys, that the administrative thing, it was brain candy for them to do a building campaign or a project, or even some of these guys, even to go and, like, be peacemakers with people that are fighting with each other in the church. Like, that's simple for you? Like, yeah, I do that all day long because I have a business to run. I have, these customers that bite my head off all day. Like, these people are simple compared to these people. I'm like, great, y'all go talk to them. All right. So, I'm going to skip a little bit of this. Did I include common objections to multiplication? Is that in your notes? All right. So, again, I think Dave mentioned this morning, but, like, we can come up with 1,000 reasons why we can't multiply. You can't multiply a group. You can't multiply a disciple. You can't multiply a church. People say, we just don't have the people to send, or we can't afford them financially, or our people aren't ready for that. Spurgeon said this, great quote: "If you stop and do nothing until you can do everything, you will remain useless." So yeah, acknowledge we can't do everything, but we can do something. Again, this is beyond the scope of disciple making, but again, we're about church planting, so we're ascending the ladder of complexity a little bit in the room. Let me just say this. Here's some ways to intentionally prepare your church to be a multiplying church. Number one, talk about church planting regularly. Saturate your teaching with biblical examples of multiplication. So I know that this is not the pastor group, but some of you may need to be the church planter. Some of you may need to be married to the church planter. Some of you don't need to think about planting a church. You need to think about planting a small group, or multiplying a group in your neighborhood, or just hosting something in your home. But you can use planting language in all of that. When we started something in our church, we didn't say we were starting something. We said we were planting something. So we're not going to start a small group. We're going to plant a small group. We're not going to start a youth ministry. We're going to plant a youth ministry. We're going to plant a men's ministry. We're not going to start a campus. We're going to plant a campus. We're not going to start a church. We're going to plant a church. And so that gets the idea that kind of the air we breathe around here is multiplication. We're going to send people away because we believe that's the way that we are going to accomplish the Great Commission Collective. All right, let me go to the last one. Intentional disciple making is evidence of the intentionality of God. So this is one of the things I love about our movement. We're so committed to gospel integrity or gospel centrality that no one should leave this conference, this workshop, or any session feeling any sense of shame or any sense of being scared into taking another step. This is not the zombie conference, zombie run conference, right? Here's the deal. God is committed to everything that we just said we ought to be doing, all right? So we're not going to go out of here like, I got to try harder, I got to run faster, I'm not going to measure up. None of that. That's not gospel centrality. That's not gospel integrity. Point 5 is gospel integrity. Intentional disciple making is evidence of the intentionality of God. Look at 1 Thessalonians 5. May the God of peace himself sanctify you completely. So Whose responsibility is it for my sanctification? This is something God does. And in response to what God does, I take steps in following him. And may your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He who calls you is faithful. Love these last words. He will surely do it. He's going to do it. You just got to show up and be intentional about disciple making. Okay? All right. Got just a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Want to clarify anything? Yes.
Practically speaking, when you were on intentionally exposed stalled movement, what might that look like? If a pre-believer or a new believer walks in, there's a lot of steps to be taken. Somebody's 10 years in, 15 years in, 3 decades into walking with Jesus, and they just thought, what is a practical step that's exposing that stalled movement?
I think it all starts with what happens on a Sunday morning. So I like to describe Sunday morning as kind of the top of the funnel. And if the top of the funnel has the kind of urgency and conviction and passion and modeling, like when you walk in there, like these people are going somewhere. There's movement. There's this expectation. They want me to be different by the time I walk out of here than when I got here. That will set our churches apart from 90% of the churches that are out there. So they may grew up in a church where it's just like, you just kind of come in, you check the box, you leave. You just kind of do your religious thing. But if there's some intentionality and urgency around the way that we're handling the Word of God and calling people to respond, it starts with that. And then that urgency cascades down into the small groups, cascades down into the staff. And so there's some intentionality around what happens in the membership class. I think it's another place, like if people are going to dare to come to the membership class, then you're going to get real clear about what the expectation is of a member. And like, hey, we're going to expect you to give. We're going to expect you to show up. We're going to expect you to serve. We're going to expect you to pray. We're going to expect you to have a multiplication mindset. And then in return for all of that, it's our commitment we're going to do all this together. You're going to be surrounded by people that are doing this together, modeling it with you. We're going to carry you when you're weak. We're going to expect you to carry us when we're weak. And so there's just that clarity of expectation. And when it gets down to like a one-on-one relationship, it's just a real clear, hard conversation with somebody who's like, hey, you seem really stuck in this mindset of anxiety and worry and fear. Can I ask you some honest conversations? Are you thinking rightly about who Jesus is and his your value to him and his value to you? It's hard conversations like, I noticed you're stuck. And that could be in an area as hard as your sexuality. They show up at the membership interview with the elder. Hey, you guys have the same address, but 2 different last names. What's going on? You seem stuck in your understanding of Jesus' call to holy sexuality, right? That's a hard conversation. So that's discipleship. I never knew what anybody gave in my church except me, but I always wanted to. The fear is that if the pastor knew what people give, he would give preferential people treatment. It was good that I didn't know, I guess. But because I knew that giving was a discipleship responsibility, it was a discipleship discussion. If people weren't giving, they're stuck. And somebody needed to expose that. But I never had the lens to see it so that I could have the hard conversation with them. You just kind of had to say, hey, are you giving? Yeah, sure. Really? The way you should be? You want to take another step in that? You're giving sacrificially? It's a hard conversation. Yeah, last question, then we got to run.
This is a quick one. Just in the context of disciple making for you, do you have any good books that you could recommend?
Yeah. Are you talking about in like, here's a book, I want us to go through this together?
No, like to equip me as a youth ministry.
Okay. Yeah.
To make disciples of my girls.
Yep. so I'd mentioned the two books that I mentioned to you, The Trellis and the Vine and The Vine Project. And then there's just a whole library of stuff that comes up. I don't know how to narrow down. The reality is, at the risk of sounding really shallow and that I'm avoiding your question, it almost doesn't matter. If you've read a book that it impacted you, to say to somebody else, hey, I'm reading this book. Would you read it? And then let's meet. And I'm thinking right now of a relationship I've got with a new friend. He's kind of stuck in his discipleship. And there's a book that I had not read that I needed to read because I was actually sending it to some other people, but I hadn't read it. And so I was like, I told my friend, like, hey, I'm reading this book. Would you read this book with me? And then he read it, and I'm reading it, and I was like, this is not even the greatest book, but it almost doesn't matter because we're just having conversation around where we're at and how we're relating to the book. It's more about the relationship probably than the content of the book. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for enduring that. We'll all go watch Crawford's lesson later, okay, and see what we missed. We'll see you guys.